I wasn't looking for giants when I started. I was looking at architecture, the small mismatches you notice when you stop treating buildings as scenery and start treating them as objects designed for bodies. Doorways that feel too tall, staircases that feel too steep, chairs and desks that seem slightly oversized, the kind of historical oddities you can file away as grandeur, intimidation, or decorative excess and move on. That is the standard frame. Large government buildings were built to impress. Oversized interiors were meant to remind people who held authority. If a doorway is 12 feet high, the easy answer is symbolism. If a staircase is uncomfortable, the easy answer is aesthetics. The story stays tidy as long as you keep each detail isolated. But then I found the photographs, not paintings, not myths, not folklore, retold into something dramatic. Photographs, images from the mid to late 1800s, showing human beings of extreme height standing next to regular-sized people. Their proportions so different that the first reflex is to assume trickery. Composite images, staged illusions, anything that lets you dismiss what you're seeing without changing your assumptions. The problem is the photographs don't behave like fakes. The grain matches, the lighting matches, the shadows fall correctly, and these images come from a period that predates convincing photographic manipulation. The formats recur, carte de visite, cabinet cards, tin types, and the subjects recur too, men, and occasionally women, described at 8 feet and sometimes 10. They are not labeled as performers. They are not presented as advertised curiosities. They are posed like anyone else in period clothing, sometimes beside family members of normal height. At that point, the contradiction isn't just that unusually tall people appear in photographs. It's that the photographs exist inside the same decades as the oversized architecture I thought I already understood. If these buildings were only built for grandeur, why do so many images place these unusually tall individuals directly in front of them, where the scale suddenly looks less symbolic and more proportionate? Before I connected any of this, the official explanations felt adequate because they were simple and they stayed in their lanes. Oversized architecture had an accepted category. It belonged to authority, ceremony, intimidation, the language of institutions that wanted to be seen as permanent. When I noticed tall interior doors or broad staircases in government buildings from the 1700s and 1800s, I could treat them as design choices made to project power. Even when those proportions appeared in corridors and working areas, the explanation still held if you assumed the architects were consistent or simply indulgent or operating within a style that favored scale. Furniture fit into its own category as well. Large desks, oversized chairs, beds that seemed slightly beyond human comfort were easy to place in the box labeled custom made. A tall person lived here. A wealthy household commissioned something unusual. A museum acquired it and filed it under decorative or Victorian design. That classification closed the question without needing more context. Institutions had their own routine for dealing with outliers. Archives acknowledge a thing exists, assign it a label, and move on. The reference points I kept seeing worked exactly like that. The British Museum archives contain photographs. The Smithsonian mentions similar images, then dismisses them as medical anomalies without further investigation. French collections catalog comparable photographs and file them away. Russian imperial records reference persons of unusual stature serving in ceremonial roles. The pattern the script describes is not an argument about motive, it's a description of institutional behavior. Acknowledge, categorize, move on. On paper, that approach is stable. It allows unusual material to exist without forcing it to reshape the larger narrative. A very tall individual becomes a medical case. A very large chair becomes a decorative artifact. A very tall doorway becomes grandeur. Each explanation remains plausible as long as the objects stay separated. That separation is what made the baseline feel normal for so long. A photograph of an unusually tall person could be dismissed as rare. A building with oversized proportions could be dismissed as stylistic. A piece of furniture could be dismissed as custom. Even the sheer geographic spread could be absorbed if you insisted that each example was local, independent, and not part of a larger pattern. The problem, at least in the way the reference script frames it, is that the baseline depends on not asking a certain kind of question, not the dramatic question, the simple one. Why were there so many? Why do the photographs cluster in specific decades, primarily between 1850 and 1900, and then suddenly disappear? Why do contemporary accounts describe these individuals not as oddities, but as normal members of society, holding positions of authority, working as guards, overseers, foremen on construction projects? Those questions are not conclusions. They are the point where the baseline explanation stops feeling complete. And once that completeness fractures, the investigation stops being about isolated anomalies and becomes about whether the categories themselves are doing the work of hiding relationships that are visible in plain sight. The shift does not come from uncovering a hidden document or a single decisive artifact. It comes from a change in how the existing material is read. The moment of discovery, as described in the reference script, begins when the photographs stop being treated as curiosities and start being examined as records. The investigation turns on the recognition that these images were not produced in exceptional circumstances. Carte de visite from the 1860s, cabinet cards from the 1870s, and tintype photographs were ordinary products of their time. They were affordable, widely used, and intended to document people as they appeared. Studios produced them routinely. Families commissioned them. Institutions archived them without ceremony. Nothing about the medium suggests spectacle. What is discovered is not one image, but accumulation. As the researcher looks deeper, the photographs continue to surface. Different collections, different countries, the same decades, the same scale difference between subjects, men and, in some cases, women standing 8 feet tall or more, positioned beside people of average height, with no visual emphasis on their difference. The circumstances of these images matter. The subjects are photographed in formal settings. They wear contemporary clothing appropriate to their social role and time period. Some stand alone. Others are surrounded by family members or colleagues. There are no banners, no explanatory captions, no framing that suggests performance or exhibition. They are not presented as circus performers, and the script explicitly notes the absence of documented names and traveling routes that would identify them as showmen. The discovery deepens when institutional references appear. The British Museum archives contain several such photographs. The Smithsonian acknowledges them briefly before categorizing them as medical anomalies. French collections show similar images, cataloged and filed away. Russian imperial records mention persons of unusual stature serving in ceremonial roles. These references confirm that the photographs were not isolated private oddities. They circulated through official channels. At this stage, nothing is being interpreted. The discovery consists of recognizing that these materials exist, that they recur, and that they are treated as ordinary enough to require no explanation within their original context. The anomaly is not declared, it is observed. The moment becomes decisive not because it proves anything, but because it raises a question that the existing categories do not answer. If these photographs were documenting something rare but understood, why do they appear so frequently within a narrow span of time, and why does their context feel so routine? By the time the evidence reaches this density, the issue is no longer whether any single explanation is possible. It is whether the explanations remain sufficient when applied consistently. The reference script does not reject the standard accounts outright. Instead, it places pressure on them by asking what they fail to address. If extreme human height is only a rare medical condition, why do photographic records show so many individuals of similar scale, appearing repeatedly within the same 50-year window? Why do these images cluster between roughly 1850 and 1900 and then disappear almost entirely, even though photography continues to expand and improve afterward? If these individuals were merely curiosities, why are they not presented as such? Why do contemporary accounts describe them as guards, overseers, and foremen, rather than as performers or oddities? Why do they appear in formal settings, in official clothing, often positioned in ways that suggest responsibility rather than display? If oversized architecture is purely symbolic, why does it appear so consistently in interior working spaces where symbolism offers no practical benefit? Why do 12 to 15-foot doors appear in back hallways and administrative corridors, rather than being confined to ceremonial entrances? Why do staircases designed for daily use require strides that strain average human movement? If oversized furniture is simply custom-made, why does it recur across different regions, institutions, and building types? Why do chairs, desks, and beds of similar disproportion appear in government buildings and administrative offices, rather than being limited to private residences of unusually tall individuals? If oversized tools are industrial artifacts, what processes required wrenches 4 to 6 feet long, produced in quantities large enough to appear repeatedly in demolition sites and estate cleanouts more than a century later? Why do these tools show wear consistent with regular use, yet lack a clearly documented function that explains their scale? The questions extend into geography and timing. Why do these architectural proportions, photographic records, and material artifacts appear across continents during the same general period? Why do government and administrative buildings in America, Europe, Russia, India, and South America share similar scale characteristics despite cultural and political differences? And then there is Tartaria. If it was merely a cartographic convention, why does it appear so consistently on maps and in encyclopedias of the 1700s and early 1800s? And why does it vanish in the mid-1800s without a documented transition? Why does its disappearance coincide with the same decades in which photographs of unusually tall individuals stop appearing? None of these questions assert intent. They do not claim coordination. They simply point to points where the standard narrative stops answering the simplest inquiries raised by the evidence already on the table. Each question emerges directly from an observed fact, and each remains unanswered within the framework that initially seemed complete. As the questions accumulate, the investigation encounters not new material, but its absence. The reference script does not describe dramatic acts of removal or explicit denial. Instead, it points to a quieter pattern, one defined by missing follow-up, curtailed inquiry, and records that stop short of explanation. The photographic evidence is acknowledged but not examined. Museums and archives hold images of unusually tall individuals, yet those images are filed under miscellaneous categories, or briefly labeled as medical anomalies. No extended analysis follows. No comparative studies appear. The photographs remain preserved, but context is absent. The same pattern appears in institutional treatment of physical remains. Throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, newspapers report the discovery of unusually large human skeletons. These reports are specific. They include measurements, locations, and descriptions of burial contexts. They are published in mainstream newspapers and treated as routine news, rather than sensational anomalies. Then, after approximately 1920, those reports stop, not gradually, abruptly. Discoveries that had once appeared regularly in print cease to surface. The skeletons already found are said to have been sent to institutions such as the Smithsonian for further study. Today, those institutions state that no such skeletons exist in their collections. They are described as missing, lost, or misplaced during routine transfers. Documentation is incomplete. Accession records do not resolve the discrepancy. Maps and reference works show a similar pattern. Tartaria appears consistently in atlases and encyclopedias of the 1700s and early 1800s. It is treated as an ordinary geographic designation. Then it disappears. Later editions omit it without explanation. No detailed account of its removal accompanies the change. The architecture attributed to those regions remains, but the name and context recede from printed history. What stands out is not a single gap, but the way multiple forms of documentation diminish at the same time. Photographs stop appearing, newspaper reports end, maps change, encyclopedias revise themselves. The script does not claim why this happens. It simply notes that the shift is synchronized enough to be observable. The silence has consequences. Without continued documentation, the earlier material becomes easier to dismiss. Without investigation, anomalies remain isolated. Without synthesis, patterns dissolve into coincidence. The absence does not prove anything on its own, but it limits what can be known, and it leaves the questions raised by the existing evidence unresolved. When the material is viewed as a whole, its significance does not come from any single example, but from repetition constrained by time, function, and scale. The reference script does not introduce an endless range of cases. It returns to the same categories repeatedly: photographs, architecture, furniture, tools, maps, and newspaper reports. What gives these categories weight is that they overlap within the same historical window and then recede together. The photographs cluster between the mid and late 1800s. The architectural proportions in question belong to buildings constructed in the 1700s and 1800s and actively used during that same period. Newspaper reports of large human skeletons peak in the late 1800s and then stop after the early 20th century. Tartaria appears on maps in the 1700s and early 1800s and disappears in the mid-1800s. These timelines do not stretch indefinitely. They converge. Geographically, the pattern does not rely on a single region. It appears across America, Europe, Russia, India, South America, and Central Asia, but always in the same types of spaces: government buildings, administrative centers, courthouses, infrastructure associated with oversight and authority. The script is careful not to describe residential architecture at the same scale, and that absence matters. The disproportion appears where power and organization are exercised, not where daily domestic life unfolds. The individuals themselves follow the same pattern. They are not described as rulers or elites, but as guards, overseers, foremen, roles that connect people to systems rather than to spectacle. They appear in photographs that feel routine rather than explanatory. They disappear from the visual record at roughly the same time that references to Tartaria fade and reports of skeletal discoveries stop appearing. The broader significance, as framed in the reference script, is not a conclusion about who these people were. It is a challenge to how historical material is sorted. When evidence is categorized too narrowly, relationships between categories are lost. Architecture is studied separately from photography. Human remains are studied separately from maps. Tools are studied separately from buildings. Each field remains internally consistent while the larger pattern remains unexamined. What emerges is not a hidden story, but a visible one that has never been assembled in full. The repetition suggests that these were not isolated coincidences, yet the lack of synthesis ensures they are treated as such. The result is a historical landscape where structures, images, and records exist side by side, pointing toward a shared context that is no longer articulated. By the end of this inquiry, nothing has been resolved, and nothing has been proven. The reference script does not arrive at a revelation. It arrives at a pause. The evidence remains exactly where it was found. The photographs still show people of unusual height standing calmly in formal settings. The buildings still contain doorways, staircases, and furniture scaled beyond average human use. The tools still surface with dimensions that do not align easily with modern assumptions. The maps still show Tartaria appearing and then disappearing. The newspapers still record discoveries that later accounts do not explain. What changes is not the material, but the frame through which it is viewed. When each element is examined in isolation, dismissal is easy. When they are placed together, the dismissals begin to feel incomplete. Not wrong, but insufficient. They answer individual questions while leaving the larger ones untouched. The silence that follows these materials becomes part of the record. Not a dramatic silence, not an accusatory one, but a procedural quiet. A lack of investigation, a lack of synthesis, a historical posture that allows anomalies to exist without ever asking whether they belong to the same story. The reference script does not tell us who these people were. It does not define Tartaria. It does not explain how the architecture was built or why the documentation receded. It only asks why these questions themselves seem unwelcome, why the patterns are acknowledged and then set aside, and why the physical world preserves traces that the written record no longer contextualizes. If the buildings remain, the photographs remain, and the records once existed, then the unanswered issue is not whether something unusual happened, but why so little effort has been made to understand how these elements relate to one another.